Okay. Once again, yeah, we're a bit out of practice. Okay. Hello and welcome to the Suibhne podcast. It is the Rabbit Hole, episode 9, I believe, a show where we promise ourselves that we plan to stick to a schedule, but inevitably take a break for a few months when we are working on content for the main channel. Nobody else has a show like that. I can promise you that. This is also a show where we wait for the customary 30-second delay to pass that we may know whether our microphone is in fact working, which it was not. I actually read this entire intro out, and you weren't here to see it. So we finally got our microphone working. Those auto mute features come back to bite you, I swear. While I'm on the subject of the video for the main channel, in case you didn't know, the video in Serbia is already finished. It is available for paying members, so if you're a YouTube member or a patron or a subscriber on Nebula, you can get that video. If you don't want to wait, you can sign up to one of those and watch it right now. It's getting rave reviews, got 10 out of 10, 5 stars, all that jazz. That's just me. That's what I think, but I'm a little bit biased. Last week's episode, which for the sake of continuity, I was going to acknowledge was streamed nearly 2 months ago, we discussed poor little forgotten Montenegro, the tiny little coastal sibling of Serbia, who, since it's split up from the rump Yugoslav state, has very much embraced a sort of new identity as this like coastal republic with all that sweet Dalmatian tourism that is so often associated with its neighbor Croatia. All those big, massive, what do you call them? Cruise ships like coming in and docking into the Dalmatian coast, those beautiful Adriatic sunshine type touristy places. That's very very much what little old Montenegro is trying to do now these days. It's quite interesting. We discussed how Montenegro once formed a core part of the independent Serbian Principality or South Slav Principality. And the focal point of the first Serbian ruling dynasty, the first monarchical dynasty, and how that was eventually subsumed and later went on to stoke a renewed independence movement during the Ottoman years. High up in the hills, in these sort of like fortified monastic towns or monastic settlements, where a prince-bishopric arose and formed the nucleus of what we see as the Montenegrin state today. But that's boring. That's all in the past. Let's talk about the future. In fact, we're not actually going to talk about the future. We're going to keep going to the past. In this week's episode, we're going to take a little break from talking about all that medieval nonsense, and let's go back a bit. Let's go back to the pre-Slavic Balkans. The Balkans backed up a little bit, out of focus, more distant past, more archaeological than historical. We're going to discuss the ancient name for the Western Balkans, the part of the Balkans that is once the former state of Yugoslavia, now is occupied by the states of Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia and all that jazz. The ancient name was Illyria. So we're going to discuss that today. What is an Illyrian? Who is an Illyria? What do Illyrians do? Are they good? Are they bad? Let's figure this out. Let's figure this out together. Before we begin, please remember to like, subscribe, also share the video, because we need 3,000 watch hours before we get the channel monetized, which is, really annoying. And we've got about 500, so we're nearly there. We're about a sixth of the way through. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by sending a super chat, which is also a great way to support the show and help me keep making new content. If you really want to show your support, you can become a member on Patreon or on the main channel memberships. Everything will be linked below, or you can hit the blue join button below any video on the main channel. You'll also get access to bonus episodes as well as a bunch of other perks. All paying members will also get their questions answered as a priority too. Okay, so the Illyrians. So what you're seeing on screen here, if you're listening to the video version of this podcast, is just sort of my imitation or rendition of what a Roman city, sort of a typical Roman city would have looked like. A lot of Roman cities were built on older cities from peoples they conquered or colonized. So this one is sort of supposed to be my rendition of Singadunum. That'll be featured in the upcoming video on Serbia. So that's modern day Belgrade, for those in the know. For all my ancient Roman fans out there, you already know. So Singadunum is very much would have been on the periphery of the Illyrian world. Very little known about it up until the Roman time. You know, it's very archaeological and that kind of thing. So most of what we know is a very archaeological type deal, which we'll go into a little bit further in this. So this is sort of what we're working with. This is the prehistoric Illyria. So if you do any research in Illyria, you'll very often find a map like this. This is sort of the political geography. Talking a little bit about these tribes or chieftains and that kind of thing, which is somewhat of an unhelpful term when we talk about tribes, because tribes doesn't really help you much, does it? It doesn't really help you understand peoples and places and things, because we like to think of the world as like divided into these really nice delineated borders between states. Like, you know, okay, you're in a Serbia here, and you got to cross over into a Croatia over there. So you got to cross over a little customs border or that kind of thing. You know, you go from one country to the other. That's sort of the biases and the framework with which we view the world today. It's very hard for us to think of the world as previous to that inception of states. And this is a problem when you're talking about ancient tribes, because they're migratory, they're pastoralists oftentimes, you know, before the advent of agriculture, and that became the dominant mode of food production in the world. You've got these very like semi-nomadic pastoralists, that kind of thing. That there's evidence that kind of thing has been present in the Balkans and what is modern day Illyria for a very long time. We won't go back that far, but we know that it's been there for a very long time. There's these ancient hill forts that have been shown signs of at least some kind of urbanism. It's hard to call it actual urbanism, because there's so many, you know, factors that have to go into what actually is urbanism. So one of the theories is that they could have been these ancient hill forts and places of refuge, typically. If the hill fort is done with unworked stone, you know, like that kind of thing, like non-smoothed down stone that is made into like a perfect square or whatever, like that kind of thing. Those kind of buildings tend to last a lot longer, and they, you know, you can repair them. You gotta command an enormous amount of manpower and know-how and resources and food and that kind of thing to even get to a point where you can, you know, command a bunch of masons to build a wall around a city, that kind of thing. That's why we tend to not call them urbanized settlements in the Illyrian lands prior to that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about what exactly is an Illyria and who exactly are the Illyrians. So the name Illyria, it's a toponym. Toponym means place name, and that's just fancy Greek for naming a thing after a people after a thing or a place. And post-classical writers, so when you get out of the Greek and Roman era, when they talk about Illyria, they're almost always referring to the place, not the people. Like, you might call somebody Illyrian, but that means they're from Illyria, not that they're like ethnically Illyrian. We talk about this a little bit. Like, I think I've expounded upon this in a couple of episodes at this point. Which I can't say for sure, because whenever I record these podcasts, they're sort of like this weird fever dream that I sort of forget everything until next time. I'm like a robot, like an android, where you just push a button and I turn on and start talking, and then as soon as the live stream ends, I just, you know, I turn off again and I can't remember anything until the next time you see me. Like that TV show Severance. Anybody ever seen Severance? Anyway, so that the place rather than the people is the thing. Talking about ethnicity is really complicated in ancient sources. You can't really talk about ethnicity in the same way that we see it today. The Greeks use this word ethnos, like ethnos, you think, okay, that's where we get the word ethnicity from, but it means tribe. It means like a people group, a sort of people around which you can draw enough distinctions. In the same way that we have criteria for what is a nation today, the ancient Greeks had their own criteria. They had their own rubric that they marked a people on, and that is one of the things that like where the origin of the word ethnos or tribe is. So you got a bunch of these tribes sort of floating around Illyria, or this land called Illyria that the Greeks called. You can see reflections of the way the Balkan peoples were represented in the Austrian imperial court. Like, for example, like the court commissions, which when you have an empire like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Middle Ages and the late, like the early modern period, they were they had a court, and that court was in Vienna, and then you had another court in Budapest, or whatever that other town is. I think it's modern day Bratislava. I can't remember where the Hungarian court was. It's somewhere around Bratislava, or in Bratislava, but I don't remember the Hungarian name. And in these courts, these were the centers of administration and representation in the imperial court of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Empire of the Habsburgs. So they had these court commissions. So every time a specific group needed representation, you would create court commissions. So you had the Illyrian Court Commission. You had Illyrian deputies when the franchise was being sort of extended to Slavic peoples of the Southern Balkans who happened to live in Hungary or Austria. They would be extended the franchise. It wasn't all in one go. So like the right to vote wasn't extended in all in one go. It was rather you would have deputies just to sort of represent people, and they weren't like picked out by anybody. There was no democracy associated with it. But this is getting too complicated. All right. So whenever you look at a legal document from the Austrian Imperial Court and anything to do with this part of the world, they call them Illyrians, or Illyrii or Illyria in Latin, as a way of describing people from that area. They're generally talking about the place, not the people. That's the important bit, I think. I think maybe I should have skipped everything I just said and just said it's just about the place rather than the people. It's a collective name for anyone who arrived from that part of the world or had their ancestry from that part of the world, which if you listen to our episode on the Slavic migrations, the Serbian migrations, which there were these enormous migrations into the Austro-Hungarian Empire from Serbia, they would have just seen these people as Illyrians, no matter if they were Romance-speaking Vlachs, Slavic-speaking Serbs, Croats, sometimes even the residents of large Venetian trading cities like Ragusa, they're all Illyrians, If the word itself ever brushed up against what we would consider an ethnic identity, then in the modern era it would have to be primarily directed at Albanians. But even that was mostly to do with them being seen as an indigenous tribal group of Illyria. They were seen as like, oh, you're in like an indigenous Illyrian rather than Slavic Illyrians or Vlach Illyrians or that kind of thing. So the idea that Albanians are themselves actually real proper descendants of ancient Illyrians, that idea that Albanians are their descendants has been around for a long time. When you've got these sort of nomadic pastoralists and semi-nomadic tribes up in the hills, excuse me, it's very tempting. It was very tempting for Enlightenment and post-classical authors to sort of describe them as indigenous Illyrians, and that very much is still around today. There's a movement within the scholarly circles of Albania to investigate and do research into whether or not modern day Albanians themselves speak a language that is descendant from ancient Albanian languages. But of course, the jury's still out and will require quite a lot of research into that kind of thing. And I'm sure there are experts on the topic that can expand upon it in great detail, of whom I am not one. So let's figure out like why did Illyria survive as a toponym? The first reference to the Illyrians were the Greeks, a type of document called a periplus, which is basically like the ancient equivalent of like a road map, like one of those road maps you used to pick up when you were a kid. You'd go into the like service station to fill up with petrol, and you'd grab one of those like tourist guides to tell you like everything that you're going to see on the road on the way down to wherever you're going. That's basically what that is, but the maritime version. So every time a Greek sailor was gonna go do some trading along the Adriatic coast, so that's this coast sort of you got the boot of Italy there, right down there, and this is the Adriatic coast along what we would modern day call Dalmatia. So all these are like little islands and stuff. These are like perfect little havens for coastal trade. So every time the Greeks wanted to trade with these people, they would go and they would buy somebody who'd previously made the journey and decided to make a record of what they would see along the way. You know, watch out for that rock. Don't touch those. Don't eat that plant. That kind of thing. And that's where we get the first record of Illyrians. Something the maritime Greeks cared a hell of a lot about was trade and sailing and that kind of thing. It was part of a collection. This periplus, a part of a collection described as being like a 6th century navigator called Skylax. So if you're a fan of like ancient Greek history, you might know that name as a navigator in the employ of I believe the Persian Empire. I can't remember which Persian emperor it would have been. But they, would send down to the Indus River and that sort of area around India to like map everything. So sometimes people would misascribe that author as to help them sell their periply, to like, hey, don't you know that this one was written by this ancient very, very good, well-known navigator? Cool, here, buy it. It'll cost you, 3 Greek ducats or whatever. So nobody actually knows who wrote this document. It is pseudo Skylax, a person pretending to be that ancient geographer. The periply were often used as like primary sources for then secondary sources like compendiums or compilations of those sorts of documents. And the perspective that we get is exactly what we would expect from the Greeks, which is like they're primarily concerned with trading and that kind of thing. It's probably dating to the 4th century BCE with much older source documents. The Illyrioi, as they are described, live along the length of the Adriatic coast north of Epirus, and they're divided into tribes, and they thrive on piracy, which is, again, this is a very Greek maritime perspective on this. Like, who knows what the inland Illyrians are doing? The ones on the coast, the ones we care about, are a bunch of bloody pirates. That's what the Greeks had to say about the Illyrians. When you think about it, it's like trying to describe the whole of the United States by sailing up the coast of Florida and catching a glimpse of Miami, and then describing all of the United States that way. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but exaggerations are fun. So we don't know what the Illyrian language was. We have absolutely no idea. There's, some people like to sort of deconstruct and reclassify the language based on modern day place names. So a place name that is, either attested as ancient in the ancient documents and survives to the modern day. You can sort of use that as an example, or you can use the modern day Albanian language, which is almost certainly part of that. But it's very unlikely that these people would have spoken the same language. Understandings of language is very it doesn't have a lot of nuance in ancient texts, because before things like universal education, languages existed on a spectrum, and that spectrum would have been part of the probably what is called the Paleo-Balkan languages, of which Greek was a part. But of course, the further you go away from Greece, the more the language is going to differ. So the Thracian language, probably the Dacian language, the Greek language, the Illyrian languages, these are all hypothesized to be part of a broad collection of spectral dialects of Paleo-Balkan languages. And anytime that the Greeks came across people who they thought, couldn't speak Greek, you're not a Greek, you're a barbarian because your language sounds like bar, 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 that kind of thing. That's why the attested form of the Illyrian language it's pretty much impossible to know, but it's very unlikely that they would have spoken the same language. Until somebody digs up a hypothetical Illyrian Rosetta Stone, there's no way to know for sure. And what you can do is you can get on a podcast and you can just ramble on and pontificate at length about things about which you know absolutely nothing. The way I've found helpful to understand the Greek literary tradition is that it itself exists on a spectrum from like histories to mythologies. That's the way the Greeks understood the world around them, and that's very difficult to untangle when you're one of the historians that have to write a treatise on these peoples. The Greeks used mythology in constructing these tapestries to really understand their neighbors and what they are and who they are and who needs to be traded with and that kind of thing. And within that tapestry, there are threads of truth. We'll never likely know the full picture, but we can get little bits of truth and make educated guesses about these people. And when you sort of have to be cautious with mythological traditions when they contain these very sophisticated what are they called, like literary formulae, the kind of thing that what ancient readers would have expected. So anytime you watch a movie nowadays, you get or a TV show or whatever, you get the 3-act structure. It's like the beginning, middle, end, and things need to happen in that in order for us to be entertained. Or you got the hero's journey is another one. It's like the call to adventure, initial hesitation. I can't remember the others, but it's like initial hesitation. You answer the call. Something you experience challenges, you overcome the challenges, and at the end, the hero succeeds, but they are changed. Right? That's like the hero's cycle. The hero's journey is like this loop, a literary formula. And the Greeks had these literary formulas. So anytime they're like writing stories about their neighbors, they're part of these literary formula. It's very easy for you to go, oh, okay, this is meant to be like dictated out loud or read in an amphitheater to a group of people to explain something, rather than actually trying to be a legit record of the truth of the matter. That's what makes these things very, very difficult to pass through. But also, that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. It's extremely worthwhile, but it's just sort of giving us that little glimpse. So within the mythic tradition, we find a figure named Illyrios. There are a couple of versions of his story that survive. The most popular is that he is the son of Cadmos, a Phoenician hero. There's lots of stories associated with him as well. He's like the founder of the city of Thebes, maybe. He married a goddess, Harmonia. Literally, that just means harmony, which is interesting. She's got an obscure origin herself. The two of them rule the city, and then they have a bunch of kids, and then they retire. They go to distant Illyria. They decide they're going to abdicate the throne and go to distant Illyria, and they become like snakes or something. It's a really weird story. But they have a bunch of kids, and one of their kids is named Illyrios, and he is supposedly the progenitor of the Illyrians. And this there's like a much later version which describes, you know, all of his different siblings, fleshed out in another version of the story. So you've got like Enkelus, Otarius. I've got them written down here somewhere. Dardanos, Mados, Taulos, Perihabos, Greek. This is all Greek to me. So you've got like names in there that you can recognize. The Otariates, that's like a prominent one. So you can see there here on the map. Autariate. I should have really looked up how to pronounce these before. It's really annoying when you see these words written this whole time you're doing research, and then you finally actually read them out loud and you figure out that you have no idea how to say them. I'm sure there'll be some Greek scholars that can correct the pronunciation in the comments. So the Dardanos, so you can see here on the map, you got the Dardanoi. That's a tribal name for these people that sort of inhabit the southern part of Serbia. So this area around what is today Kosovo, southern Serbia, that sort of area, sort of south of the Danube, south of the Morava River, that kind of area. That's one of the most interesting examples of these like toponym mythological names. The inclusion is so annoying and unhelpful because there's so many distinct characters within Greek tradition called Dardanos. Different characters who have completely different stories. And they're often confused. They're confused in the modern day, and they're confused in antiquity. They're confused because they would get conflated. They'd be like, oh, well, this person has this name. That means they must have been that. And this ancient source of everything, of all the confusion and the literary traditions, is the Iliad. And then in the Iliad, there's a Dardanos who is like supposedly the founder of a city called Dardanos around a region called Dardanos, and he is that's in the vicinity of the city of Troy. So Troy has this, you know, massive cultural impact in all the way down to our day. It's like this historical, semi-historical fiction battle that happens there. And when this Dardanos character is supposedly like the progenitor of the ruling dynasty of Troy. I keep thinking Illyria because of the Iliad. Like Iliad is means like Troy, the story about Troy in Latin, I believe, or Ilium. I can't remember. So that's led to this confusion where people think, oh, okay, maybe like the people who are the Dardanoi may be settled along the coast of what is now Troy, or where ancient Troy used to stand, and that name has survived. It survives to this day as the Dardanelles. So we call that area that around Turkey, approaching the Straits of the Sea of Marmara, I believe. So that area is called the Dardanelles. It's a famous, famously important shipping route through from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So ancient peoples thought, okay, maybe like the Dardanoi, this Illyrian people, maybe they were the original colonizers of that area. And then there was this later tradition that went in the opposite direction, saying maybe when the Trojans fell, some of their ancestors settled in Illyria and became the Dardanoi. That's one of those things that when the Romans very much don't like that story, because they don't like to think of themselves as being related. They thought of themselves as being related to the Trojans and the Dardanoi and Dardanos. But it's not great if there's a rival people in the Mediterranean who also think that, and if those happen to be cheese-eating barbarians who live in the hills, that's not great for them either. So there's all these different methods of trying to reconcile that. One of those methods is just saying, well, sure, they might be descendants of Dardanos and the Trojans, but they eventually got corrupted by all the barbarians living around them, and now they're just a bunch of cheese-eating barbarians living in that region. And another way you can do it is to just say, no, you're wrong. you don't descend from the Dardani. You don't descend from Dardanos. You actually descend from this other thing. So they invent a counter story to try and like erase the previous story. It's one of those interesting things because these ancient, especially the Romans, these ancient peoples had such respect for antiquity, for things that came before them. They were very conservative and very retrospective in their approach to the world around them, and they viewed the past as the glorious time. Even like there were emperors at the height of Rome's power as an imperial force who still look back on the past being like, oh wow, like things were so much better back then. Things were so much better under Alexander the Great and the previous dynastic peoples that existed. This is just something that maybe it's sort of human nature to look back at antiquity and sort of think things were better in the past. Okay, so back to the historical end of the spectrum. What we know is like always in reference to Greek interactions with very specific Illyrian polities. Some of them are tribal, some of them are monarchic. You got various things that you can translate into the word like chieftain or king or that kind of thing, but that doesn't really help us understand like what exactly their what their social or political structure was. Brad, how's it going? The sources for this are like Hecatatius of Miletus. He was writing in the 6th century BCE. Then in the 5th century, you've got Thucydides. The father of history, Herodotus, Polybius, the 2nd century BCE, Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE, and Strabo in the turn of the millennium. Appian, that's the famous Roman writer that was writing in around the 2nd century CE. And then a 3-volume compendium on Greek mythology called the Bibliotheca also contains reference to their political geography, written sometime in the Roman 1st century CE. So these are our main sources. There are a bunch of other sources, especially when you go into like the actual like Roman historical period when they start to talk about their interactions with them, but we don't care about them right now. These authors all are united in expressing quite a lot of contempt for the Illyrians. They describe them as iron using, so that's important. Obviously, if they have iron, they know how to work iron, or at least import iron, and they know how to rework it like into other things. Whether or not they know how to like smelt it and that kind of thing, that's ambiguous to the Greeks. They seem to talk about like they seem to try and like outdo each other in describing how barbaric the Illyrians are. And they had very little motivation to portray them in a favorable light. These were people that were somewhat hostile, and they knew nothing of what the Greeks saw as markers of civilization, living in an urbanized fortified city, drinking wine, cooking your food. Like they often ate like raw food, for example. I don't know if they would have eaten raw meat. I haven't read anything that would suggest that, but they certainly ate like foraged vegetables and that kind of thing. But the chief among them is speaking Greek. If you don't speak Greek, then you're not Greek. In the way that the ancient Greeks saw it. They considered people who spoke Greek. They were like, okay, you're kind of Greek. You think about the Macedonians or the Epirots, these people who like, you're kind of Greek to the Greeks. But yeah, okay, well, you're sort of half barbarian, half Greek. And then you've got like a full barbarian, which is an Illyrian, The first reference to an actual Illyrian polity is called the Enchelae or Encheliae, a loose tribal confederation centered on Lake Ohrid. So if you look on screen, Lake Ohrid is sort of right down here at the bottom. It is the larger of the two lakes, sort of inland from what is Albania. That seems to be a center of political life for a lot of Illyrian tribes. But you're going to basically hear the Greeks talk about a lot of specific tribal names. The best known of these is got to be the Taulanti or Taulantioi in Greek, and they are theorized to pretty much be the power brokers in the southern Illyrian kingdom, this part of Illyria that sort of abuts what is today modern Albania and North Macedonia, that sort of area. And they come and go in strength, but it seems like a lot of their political capital, or ability to control other tribes, it looks like it's coming from them, or at least peoples that the Greeks called the Taulanti, or the people that were pretending to be the Taulanti. If you're a related Illyrian people and you know that name, the Taulanti, carries a lot of weight, you might pretend to be them, the same way that the Saxons of medieval England, the way the Saxons sort of lost their Saxon identity and embraced an Anglish identity, so we call them the Anglo-Saxons. They embraced an Anglish identity in claiming to be the inheritors of the legacy of the ancient or older Anglish kingdoms that existed on the northern part of Great Britain. And when the Vikings came along and destroyed those kingdoms, the Saxons said, no, we're actually Anglish, and that's why the Saxon part of English has disappeared, over time. But that's not related to what we're talking about today, so I don't even know why I brought it up. So those Taulanti, and then you've got like different groups called the Desareti. They're mostly known as like pesky neighbors of ancient Macedon and Thessaly, which is that sort of central part of Greece, and Epirus, that sort of northeastern, northwestern part of Greece. And they raided and sacked Greece all the time. These people aren't necessarily lumped together immediately, but later authors would then describe them as Illyrian. And it seems that the first time the word Illyrian or Illyrioi, it appears in Herodotus's histories. So Herodotus, the famous person who founded history, as we know today, this sort of like method of investigation, learning by inquisition. I think that's what like historia means. We can glean that the name Illyrii or Illyrioi was almost certainly confined to a group straddling the coast inland from a lake called Skada, which you can also see here on the map there. And there's Skaturi was another name for it, I think. And it's that sort of like big inland lake around this northern section here. Sort of trying to bring in focus here. Anyway. At least some of the Illyrians are described as itinerant, and it seems like this name, Illyria, eventually would get transposed and become used for the people as a whole. Kind of like if you'd never met somebody from Italy and then one day you meet a Sicilian, and then you just kind of call all Italians Sicilian from that moment forward because the first Italian you ever met was from Sicily. It's kind of like that. But they were definitely itinerant, at least some of them. They moved from place to place, which is why it's so hard to draw borders around these people. And they did so in response to things like trade customs. They did so in response to changing weather patterns or seasonal migrations. The Dinaric Alps, the part of the Balkans that is sort of this rises as this massive geographic feature above the landscape of the Balkans, have been havens of semi-nomadic pastoralism, herding different animals, all the way up until the 21st century. This has been around for a long time, and drawing those borders around these peoples is essentially in vain. The first Illyrian kingdom along the Adriatic south coast and hinterland is variously called just like the Kingdom of the Taulanti, or whoever happens to be in charge. It's usually the Taulanti, and then the Dardanians are further inland. May as well be on the moon to the Greeks. It is so far out of their sphere, so far out of their understanding of the world. They're not sending anybody up there to go and look at those things. They're not sending anybody up there to go and report on these people. Nah, this is the most remote part of their world. I read one book. In one book, it's like, there's this this idea of Britain being present in ancient Greek sources. That probably would have been the way the Greeks saw the northern part of the Balkans, even though it's sort of they're right on their doorstep, they're neighbors, and I think that's just quite interesting that their interests did not align in trying to pursue a better understanding of their immediate neighbors for a long time. The Greek colonial cities along the shores had a very strong colonial component. So, like, when they were setting up these trade colonies, you've got like Thucydides records a city named Epidamnos, which eventually becomes Dyrrachium or Dyrrachion. It's settled by colonists from Greece, from Corinth and Corfu. Appian, the Greek Roman historian, writing much further later in time, several centuries. He's writing in the turn of the century. He expounds on these great mythological sources for the origin. He says the city of Epidamnos was taken over by the Illyrian Taulanti, who lived in the hinterland of the city. It was taken over then by the Liburni, who are from much further north. I don't know if they're present on this map or not. Can't tell. But they were from much further north, probably around what is today sort of Croatia and the Croatian islands of northern Dalmatia. And eventually it was taken over by the Greeks again, who built most of the city that Appian would have been familiar with. So he would have been able to know and understand and see resources about what the city of Dyrrachium was. So there's other versions of the story. So, like, the Greeks themselves claim that no, we settled it and we've always been in charge. And these contradictions stem from these authors in enormous spaces of time, and they're adapting their historical and mythological records to reflect these large-scale migrations and movements and pastoralism, that kind of thing, that would have been very normal in that part of the world in that time. And all the political infighting. So, like, sometimes you'll see the one specific Illyrian tribe will come in and take over the city, and then you look at the archaeological record and you can say, okay, yes, like, there was definitely a movement, there was definitely a migration over a couple of decades, and that explains why the Illyrian cities, the Greek cities along the Illyrian coast during Appian's time, would have had an Illyrian component. They would have had an Illyrian population. Apollonia is the other one, like further south, closer to Greece, and they definitely would have had, like a Greek-speaking population and an Illyrian-speaking population. And these mythological constructs, these tapestries, and these histories are very much Appian trying to reconcile what he sees as a contradiction in the presence of these people. Especially when he's looking at older sources and older texts describing the origins of the Illyrians from the Greeks, for example. And if there were any other resources or texts about the Illyrians, they did not survive, or they did not get seen as being important enough to record. Strabo, the other Roman geographer, wrote Geographia, which, creative name. He also wrote around the turn of the millennium, and he created a political map for the tribes, and that's like pretty much what we're looking at now, I believe. So this is where he places them, and before the Romans even got into what is Illyria. So I have this little Illyrian here. So this is somebody. This is my sort of depiction of Illyrios, the mythic figure. And he's wearing this, what is called, sometimes people call this like the Greco-Illyrian helmet, but it's like more known as the Illyrian helmet. This is sort of found in burial sites all over Illyria, and it's something that archaeologists and historians are trying to like pass through these like ancient records to try and figure out, okay, what is this? Why it looks very Greek. It looks like its origin is Greek, and yet it's been found all over Illyria pretty much exclusively. So it's like, were the Illyrians just importing one specific helmet type? And if so, does that mean they had a very strong trading relationship for that kind of thing? And if so, why would the Greeks be supplying a people that they saw as their enemies with things that would help them in warfare? So that's a big unanswered question. And one of the hypotheses is that the reason why all of these helmets have been found in ancient Illyria, in these archaeological sites, is because they probably had a very like robust mercenary relationship with the Greeks. They probably sold themselves as mercenaries. They were a warlike, brigand type, nomadic, barbarian type people, and that's a great thing to use in your army if you're a Greek city-state. So that's like the leading theory, I think, about the relationship that the Greeks would have had with the prehistoric Illyrians. And that makes sense because the Greeks were having tons of wars. The Greek martial tradition goes back so far. You know, like it goes back to the prehistoric era. It goes back to the Bronze Age. Prior to the Bronze Age collapse, at least, you know, the reconstruction of their past would have been very difficult. But the classical and archaic Greek writers were trying to reconstruct their past, and it seems as though during the Bronze Age collapse there would have been this massive migration south of these like Illyrian peoples, and that part of it would have been due to the collapse of the Mycenaean state, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Bronze Age Greeks that would have held a lot of sway. That state essentially collapses due to yet unknown reasons were in the broader Bronze Age collapse. And this is the figure around which Illyrius is sort of being birthed out of the tradition, this martial tradition of trying to understand these northern neighbors, as well as the historical and mythological tradition of trying to put those in context and apply all these sort of like literary formulae. The Illyrians themselves were the victims of like another migration, probably the Celts. So prior to the Roman expansion into what is Illyria, there was a massive expansion of the of Celtic people, of Gallic people, that, you know, even made it all the way down to Turkey, what is that, like modern day Turkey, Galatia. Gaul, is that like that's where that name comes from. And then you had the Squadiski, who inhabited most of like the southern or central region of Serbia, right to the north of the Dardani, that kind of thing. And was one of these theories is like why these in the sort of maybe like 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries BC. That's sort of around the time that these Iron Age Celts are like migrating south and sacking Greece and that kind of thing. They're pushing these Illyrians further down. That's one of the theories, and you can see on screen there the Ardeioi. They're a tribe that gets pushed down and eventually subsumes the authority of these previous Illyrian tribes. And it's very hard to paint a real picture of what all happened, because all of this stuff is very murky and blurry, and a lot of the stuff that is written about them is of dubious understanding. So the Squadiski definitely are present by the time of the Roman arrival. They're like the one-time allies of the Romans, and then eventually enemies of the Romans, who eventually get conquered themselves, which is kind of something you can say about every tribe that the Romans interacted with. The cultic culture flourished. This really is evident in like material cultures. So like post-Hallstatt culture. So the Hallstatt is like this archaeological culture that the archaeologists call it's around modern day Austria. And there's similarities that you can see this Hallstatt culture like very much spreads all over the continent, you know, from Eastern Europe all the way to Britain. That's like the cultic culture that spreads all around. this is where the Illyrians start to play a much bigger role in the politics and the affairs of what's happening in Greece. They are much closer to the Greek world than they once were. They have the hostile Celts and that kind of thing to their north, and they're pressing further south. So like Macedonia and Epirus, Thessaly, that kind of area is very much becoming intertwined with what's happening in Illyria, and or vice versa. So when you have the Peloponnesian Wars breaking out between Athens and Sparta, you start to see the Illyrians make themselves known. They start throwing their weight around, and it's because they're a source of mercenaries, or at least that's the hypothesis, And if that hypothesis is correct, the Illyrian states could essentially have been mercenary armies with a chieftain the size of a state. The apparatus and size of a state controlling a piece of territory or controlling an area, and what the Greeks would have called an ethnos, a tribe. The apparatus, the economy for which, when you think about a state today, it's like, okay, what does a state do? A state does defense, a state does taxation, a state does infrastructure. There's all these like roles that have been associated. And the more a state does, the bigger the state is. We could talk about small state, big state. How big should the government be? How big should the state be? The role of the state. So if you're thinking about these ancient peoples, the role and size of the state is tiny and focused mainly on one or two things. That's the hypothesis anyway. So in this hypothesis, they're essentially controlling mercenary activity. And this maps very well with the piracy allegations that the Greeks have. If some of the older Illyrian polities are in fact states whose primary method of directing the state is in piracy, is in looting, is in building ships and disrupting trade networks and stealing things. Very similar to a sort of raiding, trading, mercenary type thing that the Greeks of the Peloponnesian War would have been familiar with. It's fascinating to me that this is something that is echoed very much throughout human history. You think about the Vikings. The states of the Vikings were very much trace their lineage, their dynasties, trace their lineage to these sort of mercenary armies that get put into the employ of bigger, more powerful neighbors, or they're controlling the Viking and raiding themselves. They're pirates. They're stealing things and raiding coastal villages and monasteries and that kind of thing. That is the core around which these the early Viking monarchies, the Old Norse, like Danes and Norwegians and Swedes, around which they get their power. And I think that's just sort of like a fascinating thing to look at these echoes throughout history in major different places and time periods. So during those Peloponnesian Wars, the Macedonians made an alliance with the Spartans, and they're fighting against the Greeks. And then there's like this hostile kingdom on the periphery of the Greek world, and that's Lyncus. And then they decide, we're going to ally against them. You're going to help me out. Like the Spartans are going to help out the Macedonian king to defeat these Lyncestians. And they're like, okay, hang on. Before we engage them, we got to wait for the Illyrian mercenaries to come. Cool. So what happens next? Well, the Illyrian mercenaries join the Lyncestians, and the allied armies of Macedon and Sparta are reportedly so frightened of the Illyrians that they chose to retreat rather than face the Illyrian army, which I think is quite telling that these Illyrian soldiers, these Illyrian mercenaries, would have had quite a lot of quite a reputation among the Greeks, and they would have been quite familiar with them as war prowess people, that kind of thing. Selling themselves as mercenaries probably brought in a lot of income into Illyria, plunder, possibly slaves, although this is debated, and this helped transform these tribal confederations into kingdoms that had a lasting effect on the politics of the region. The Illyrian kingdom that we talked about earlier, that southern Illyrian kingdom, the Taulanti, deposed a Macedonian king. The Diodorus, another one of those other ancient sources, claims that the Illyrian kingdom were mercenaries for Sicily in their war against Epirus, and they essentially were interested in plunder. They were interested in getting paid and moving on and affecting the politics of whatever was happening at the time to be more favorable to themselves. So they're often paid off, sort of like brigands, sort of like Vikings, that kind of thing. Like you talk about the Danegeld and the Viking. That's another like analogous way of thinking about it. The Alexander II of Macedon pays off the Illyrians. That's like one of those things that he does. And then during the rise of Philip II, he is famously a hostage of the Illyrians. So let's see if we can get something up here on screen. So this is sort of the time. This is just sort of Illyria. You get the Greek world. Sort of this sort of time period that we're looking at. So this is 358 BC I have here, and this is the later period of time that we're working with here. So we've got the Greeks, we've got the Taulanti and Dardani, and then Macedon, and Epirus and Thessaly, that sort of area. So this is the sort of political area that we're working with. Have that up on screen for your viewing pleasure. So Philip II, the great Greek leader, the Macedonian leader, who is the father of Alexander the Great, he is a hostage of the Illyrians, probably the Taulanti, and he learns a lot and is prior to his move to Thebes, and he spends some time over there, and he learns a lot about them. He learns how to defeat them. He's in his rise to power, they feature quite heavily, so he defeats the Illyrians a couple of times, and this is when you start to see the Illyrians be like sort of transferred to like a client state, and then they still maintain this like role within Greek society, but as like kingmakers, they support or depose or whomever they choose, and that sort of makes them very powerful and like an enemy that you don't want to have against you. Philip defeats the Dardanians in a war. We don't know much about that war, but it seems like Philip is very much like trying to just destroy the Persian Empire. And that I didn't actually draw that on this map here because they're not relevant to that part of the story. But when Philip is got this grand idea of like destroying the Persian Empire, which he passes on to his son Alexander, of the great fame, and what he wants to do is shore up his border. He wants to shore up the people to his north and make sure that they're not going to attack Macedon and destroy it while he's away. And that's one of the reasons why he sort of throws his weight around trying to affect the Illyrians. And Philip is assassinated famously by his bodyguard. And one of the sources claims, Diodorus claims, that this was during his campaign against the Illyrians. The specific Illyrians would have been in that sort of like light orange part that you see on screen here. The Autariatae, who themselves would eventually, later get displaced by the Skordiski, that Celtic-speaking population. But they're evidently still present around that time. So controlling that frontier would have been the reason why Macedonia was so well positioned to rise as the preeminent Greek state. They are fighting against these barbarians, and they also have the easiest access to them as mercenaries. So this is something where the martial traditions of both of these different people rub off on one another. They influence one another over time, and that is generally what is going to help Macedon rise as this preeminent state. The idea of iron sharpening iron. You need something hard to sharpen something hard. This is a common theme that you find throughout this sort of ancient period. And during the Hellenistic era, so you've sort of got this like rise of Rome. This is like well into the Roman period, but before the Dardanians and Illyrians are properly incorporated into the Roman era. So prior to all of this, the Hellenistic era, which is this time, these like city states that survive the conquests of Alexander the Great. And in this Hellenistic era, the Illyrian polities are evidently still around and present but weakened. And Alexander's general inherits part of his realm. He inherits the part of Macedon, Cassander, so he's quite famous as well, or infamous. He defeats an Illyrian king, Glaucius or Glaucius. Just as Alexander had, Alexander was also campaigning against these people. And he is also famous for another reason, this King Glaucius. So he's defeated, but he is he famously helps restore a deposed prince of Epirus named Pyrrhus. And this is the king that will eventually go on to invade Italy and hand a bunch of defeats to the Romans, the Roman Republic, during their initial rise. So you have all these Greek city-states that exist, in Sicily and the bottom of the boot of Italy, called Magna Graecia, like Greek Major Greece. And they're like, hey, we don't like the Romans. Can you please help us, Epirus? And during Pyrrhus's day, King Pyrrhus's day, he was seen as like Alexander come again. The guy couldn't lose a battle. He was just waving his big stick around and really, more of a stick than a carrot guy, it seems, in motivating people to do what he wants. And this is the thing that nearly brought the Romans to their knees. They couldn't defeat the guy. They just had to wait for when he had to leave, because of course he couldn't resupply himself, and that's where we get the term Pyrrhic victory from. It's a victory where you can't follow it up with total conquest. And this Pyrrhus, this king, would have been killed as an infant, but he escaped and is raised in Illyria by King Glaucius. And one of those interesting things where you realize, okay, well, the Illyrians were clearly, literally, kingmakers. They held enormous sway militarily and politically in these ancient Greek kingdoms. And if some of those little pieces had gone a little differently, who knows what would have happened? Because the Italians of the Roman Empire, the Romans start to think, okay, well, every time they nearly get destroyed, they use that as a learning experience. And nearly getting destroyed by Pyrrhus is one of the reasons why they thought, okay, well, we should probably go and conquer the Greeks because they might conquer us. And the same reason why they nearly got defeated by Carthage, Hannibal and that kind of thing. And then they go and destroy Carthage and Hannibal. So we could have been living in a very different world if it weren't for these Illyrian polities that were on the periphery in the Greek and Roman world. And I think that that's quite interesting. Interesting perhaps only to me, but anyhow. So the Illyrians heavily influenced that part of the world, and it seems as though that their pastoral economy would eventually have shrunk, and then there would have been the rise of actual true urbanization and that kind of thing, starting to like control sources of wealth, and there's like minted coins and controlling taxation, that kind of thing. So they're definitely being influenced by their classical Greek and Roman neighbors, but not in a way that you would expect for as long as they were on the periphery of that world. You would have expected them to become really Hellenized over time, but they really weren't. And it's a testament to the fact that this is like some of the most remote parts of the Greek and Roman world. The just having a look at my notes here. The the Dardanians are one of these tribes, or the Dardanoi that we discussed earlier. They're among the people with whom the Greeks had the closest in terms of proximity. They're right there. They're right next to the Greeks, but they still just operated on the periphery of the Greek mind. They wouldn't have seen them as important or interesting or any of that kind of thing at all for most of their period that they were known about. And it wasn't until they become these like kingmakers that they start to become expounded upon. So like their story is just so vague. We don't know much about them. We just know, like, sometimes you'll get like a reference to a king and you go, okay, well, that's probably a Dardanian king. Sometimes it's explicit, but very rarely. One of the most indisputable Dardanian kings, Longarus, warred with Macedon, raided and looted them if their king was away on campaign. And he earns a spot among those that the Macedonian dynasty considered their most loathsome enemies. That is something that the Macedonians start to think of, like the Dardani or the Dardanian kingdom, as like, oh, like that's like Carthage to Rome. Like we really need to control these guys. We really need to make sure we know humble them when we don't let them destroy us. And when these Celtic migrations happen and everybody is pushed south, that becomes ever more important. This is like way more important now that the Illyrians are having a much more outsized role in Macedonian affairs and Greek affairs in general. The RDAI, who we talked about a little bit earlier, they're one of those ones that sort of migrated south. You can sort of see them here, north of Lake Skada. They're possibly the ones that benefit the most from those Celtic invasions because they seem to like subsume the role of the preeminent Illyrian state prior to the Roman invasions. And there was this specific king, Agron, and he, it seems like, resurrects this tradition of like the Illyrians being pirates. He's like, okay, we're going to centralize this piracy. We're going to centralize our role as a pirate state, and we're going to be really mean to all the people around us by stealing all their stuff. The Romans are like fighting Hannibal. The Romans are like having to move enormous amounts of like resources around and cut down timber forests for their ships and that kind of thing. A wartime economy causes like this great explosion in trade across the Adriatic and that kind of thing. And the Illyrians under Agron are like, cool, we're going to steal it. We're going to steal these things. We're going to, in the same way that like the exploration of the New World, the exploration of America caused this explosion of trade and resource extraction and slavery and that kind of thing across the Atlantic. Suddenly you have all these pirates who start popping up going, okay, cool, I'm going to steal some here and there and create these little pirate kingdoms all over the world in these like major centers of trade, that kind of thing. That's essentially what is happening with King Agron. And then he died, and his wife, Teuta, becomes regent, and she really expands their power. She's seen as this like warrior princess type queen, wicked queen Jezebel types, and the rise of the Roman state starts to come into conflict with this person. So she receives Roman envoy, a Roman embassy to her court, and she decides that she's going to kill them. She's going to make a spectacle of them. She's going to make an example of them and show the Romans that she doesn't mess around. And then the Romans are like, okay, cool, we're going to send an army to come and kick you out of the coastal cities. So that's the first Illyrian war, and that's very much the Romans trying to control the frontier of the Adriatic. It's their liquid frontier, this ocean, the sea next to them. They need to control that and get rid of all the pirates. So she is eventually cowed into submission by this powerful Roman army, and eventually, abdicates or something. I can't really remember. the records of this like first Illyrian war, you're not going to be surprised, was incredibly sympathetic to Roman interests, and doesn't really have a doesn't really try to have a full and comprehensive record of comings and goings of what's happening in Illyria beyond what actually mattered to the Romans. So any records that we have seem like a full and clear picture until you realize, actually, you know what, they're probably not going to be expounding upon these at great length. So this is sort of around the time when you can sort of see this map happening. The Illyricum is what the Romans would have called it, and they sort of set up this client kingdom along the coast of the Adriatic to try and shore it up as this natural liquid border. And they put in there's this specific king, I can't remember, but he's like young, and he eventually gets taken over by a general named Demetrius, who is an Illyrian who was once a general, probably within the armies of Queen Teotis, and he eventually he rules the Illyricum, or that sort of like Roman puppet state province, from an island called Pharos or Paros, and he is soon lured into an alliance with Macedon, and he starts resuming Illyria's pirating ways, which causes the second Illyrian War, which is sort of this thing that you'll see repeated time and time again with the Illyrians. They love to provoke and be kingmakers in this world, and they're always constantly going to either raid and pirate or sell themselves as mercenaries and that kind of thing. It just keeps happening, and then they just keep getting defeated, and then the new king that is set up, he's like related to the previous dynasty. He gets set up after they get defeated. They defeat Demetrius. The new king renewed the alliance with Rome. He tried to be a proper puppet state. Romans had other problems on their hands at the time. The aforementioned Punic Wars. They're being ravaged by Hannibal, and King Philip V. I think it's the fifth. I can never remember. There's too many Philips and too many Alexanders in Macedon. But King Philip V of Macedon sees the rise of like Hannibal and like destroying Italy as his opportunity to strike. So he attacks the Romans and their allies along the Illyrian coast. And when Hannibal is defeated, the Romans turn right around and declare war on Macedon and invaded as soon as they defeated Hannibal. And the Illyrian king joined the Romans. Again, they're switching sides again because they're kingmakers. And then the king of Dardania, a guy named Bato, they all enter the war on Rome's side because they can see the writing on the wall. And their combined forces defeat King Philip of Macedon. And this is really when like Rome starts to really take over Greece and take over the Balkans. It's like paving the way for them to enter their armies and have a real proper control over Greece and these like kingdoms that are the legacy of the Macedon, Alexander's empire, whom the Romans really respected. They had a lot of respect for that empire, and like to be able to control it and have influence over it was an enormous feeling of success for the Romans. And Philip becomes a puppet of the Romans, and he starts supporting them in their interests, and joins them in their war against the Seleucids, which is another one of these pre or post Alexandrian states. And the Romans start to think, okay, well, we seem to be sending a lot of troops through the Balkans. We should really try and control this area. So we can have our thumb on Macedon, we can have our thumb on the Seleucids and that kind of thing, and eventually conquer them. And I think we've been going long enough now that I'm starting to lose my voice. So I think maybe we're going to have to pause it there and continue this discussion next time. We can maybe talk about the Great Illyrian Revolt and why that name Illyria would continue to survive. So, just another reminder to like, subscribe, share this episode if you enjoyed it. I'm sorry I was gone for such a long time. If you want to ask a question, you can do it via Super Chat, or if you become a member on the main channel YouTube page, linked below. And we have a couple of questions from last time from a few people. So I'm just going to pull up my screenshots. So we have I have a quite a long comment from the episode on episode 2 from a YouTube member named Obrad. I don't know if that's you in the comments there that I can see, but if that is you, hello, welcome. You said, I would like to say a few things about the part that you were talking about, and then you've got a timestamp there. I guess it's something to do with them being the successors of the Serbian Empire, claiming to be the successors of Rome. So your comment reads, as far as I can remember, we were never taught that we were loyal to the Byzantines and didn't see either them or Hungary as our friend or ally. It was just a pure game of interests. Also, I read this before and I'm getting confused as to where the statement that Serbs are Romans and where that we are the successor of Rome is coming from, because we've never been taught that. Our Tsar, Dusan, was crowned as a Tsar of Serbs, Bulgarians, and Romans. Greeks were referred to as Romans back then, blah, 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 blah. His life goal was to reconquer Constantinople and create a Serbo-Roman Empire that would replace the Byzantines, but since he suddenly died, that never happened. Yes, so what you've said there is true. There's just a couple of caveats to that. So becoming an emperor is not something that just anybody can do at the time. The emperor or the Tsar or the Augustus or the Basilius, these are all very respected titles that are seen as respected from antiquity. And the reality of the military situation on the ground of the Balkans at the time was that Dusan was undoubtedly the most powerful of the dynasties that existed at the time. So there was like a renewed Bulgarian Empire at the time. The Byzantine Empire still existed, but the reality on the ground was that they were very much the most powerful state in the Balkans. And this is something that is very much a copy of what the Bulgarians had done. So the Bulgarians are the first to sort of set up their first pentarchy patriarchate. So they like set up their own patriarchate, and then that patriarchate crowns their emperor crowns their king as a Tsar, which comes from the word Caesar. So there's that imperial claim there. But the crowning an emperor was still incredibly legalistic and philosophical. You had to make this legalistic and philosophical reason for why it happened. So although Dusan's dynasty would have seen themselves as kings of the Serbs as an ethnic group, as a people, they're sort of fusing two traditions there. Because one is the tradition of being descendants of these like saintly, very saintly and very old archonic figures within the Serbian migrations that happen into the Balkans. So there's these Župans and knezes, these great chieftains and princes that exist within the South Slavic cultural tradition. But by Dusan's time, he is very much inheriting a role that his family is this like saintly family, the Nemanjić dynasty. So he's inheriting this very Christianized role as the godly ordained ruler of the Serbs as a people group, but he's also making a claim to being a legal successor of the Roman Empire, because the majority of the territory that he controls is Roman. So like you said, it's Greek, but it's Roman. They would have seen themselves as Roman. Not hard for you to put two and two together, and if you're the most powerful monarch on the continent, it's not hard for you to, on that part of the continent, it's not hard for you to draw a distinct line between these two traditions and decide to try and fuse them. So that's why you have to sort of make the argument that you are legally have the right and philosophically have the right to succeed the Roman Empire in Constantinople. So initially, I believe Dushan had tried to. I think he would have preferred to wait until he conquered Constantinople, but for whatever reason, he couldn't do that yet, or he wasn't ready to do that yet. I don't remember exactly the reason why, but he decides that he's going to declare himself emperor beforehand. And then if things had gone his way, that would have very much been seen as like a legalistic, true conquest, and would have been definitely part of that a part of that milieu of trying to succeed the Roman Empire. This was not altogether uncommon. You know, there's Bulgarian emperors who try to take Constantinople. There are, of course, the Latins. You know, got the Latin Empire that happens during the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade. The Byzantine Empire is destroyed. So this is not altogether unprecedented. But yeah, it's sort of complicated. I hope I answered your questions, but there were definitely these ideological and legalistic justifications for why the Dushan had to sort of claim to be the Roman emperor. He had to claim that he was his official title. Yes, he was seen as definitely Emperor or Tsar of the Bulgarians, but that title is very much not represented in his like official title, which was Emperor of the Serbs and Romans. And yeah, it's one of those interesting things that developed out of trying to fuse together these two very distinct monarchical traditions. But thank you so much for your question, and thank you for supporting the show and supporting the channel. Next, I have a patron named Vladimir. He's commented on the episode on Serbia. One of the prerequisites for being an Orthodox archbishop is to be a monastic. So no, Saint Sava did not abandon his monastic vows. Yes, so I answered your question on Patreon, but I just thought I'd do so here, just clarify. Thank you very much for supporting the channel on Patreon. There are definitely arguments to be made that he didn't abandon his monastic vows, but the scholarly consensus is that he most certainly did. Getting involved into the dynastic political struggles of the dynasty from which Saint Sava came was definitely a no-no. It was definitely not something pursuant to his role as a monastic seeking office. So had he sought some sort of other office, if you wanted to become a bishop or a lower ranking bishop or that kind of thing, that may have been a possible excuse that he didn't abandon his monastic vows. But the fact that he was very much involved in the dispute between his siblings and seen as this purely motivated saintly person means that he is accepting a role outside of the realm of his monastic vows. So in the monastic tradition, so you've sort of got the division of Christian roles divided into like a secular role and a more spiritual role. I can't remember the exact division and how it works, but like the division of the spiritual role is the monastic. It's the person who retreats to a monastery, and then the secular part of that would have been holding office within the church. So deacons and bishops and that kind of thing. So that is him. By retreating from his monastic life, you still keep those that role as a monastic. You keep that those vows that you've taken, but retreating from monastic life into the secular life and deliberately going on to create a constitutional state by marrying the state and church together. You definitely find a case to be made that he abandoned his monastic vows. And I think if you look into like poetry and that sort of thing, and records of sayings of Saint Sava, whether they be oral or whatever. He's definitely like embracing that sort of like secular role for himself, because or at least he was aware of the role that this monastics should have completely separated from secular life, because he writes to his father, who is old, and it's a couple of years before his father abdicates the throne, Saint Simeon, and he says to him, "You've done all you can. You've done all you can to that God has charged you with in this life, to as a king. Now it's time to devote yourself to the spiritual pursuits." And that is the reason that we are told, at least this is within literature and that kind of thing, that is the reason we're told why Stefan Nemanja abandons he abdicates his role on the throne, and becomes a monastic along with his son, Saint Sava, in Mount Athos. So yeah, I hope that clarifies your question. But again, I'm not an expert on any of this. I've just that's just my understanding of it. Okay, we've got no super chats for this episode. That should be everything. I will see you all next week.